She found out her husband was dead the same way she found out he had been lying to her for 11 years, which was by reading something she was not supposed to see, and the specific cruelty of that symmetry is the thing that Celeste Fontenot has told me she thinks about most when she allows herself to think about that Thursday morning in October at all. The obituary was published in the Times-Picayune, and a colleague at her New Orleans accounting firm forwarded it to her without context. Just a link and a question mark, because the colleague had recognized the name and the photograph and had not known what else to do with what she was looking at. And Celeste Fontenot opened that link at her desk at 9:47 on a Thursday morning in October and read the name of her husband of 11 years in the first line and felt the specific cold that arrives when two things that should not be in the same sentence appear in the same sentence. And then she read the rest of the obituary, and the cold became something else entirely. Something that did not have a single clean name because it was made of too many different things arriving simultaneously: grief and shock and fury, and the specific particular devastation of someone who has just discovered that the story of their own life has been edited without their knowledge or their consent or their presence in the room where the editing happened. The obituary described Bernard Fontenot as a devoted partner to a woman named Sylvia. It described him as a committed member of his gently neighborhood community. It described his years of dedicated work as a commercial property manager in the greater New Orleans area. It described his survivors, which included his mother Odette and his brother Clement and his sister Adrienne and Sylvia, and it did not mention Celeste, not as his wife, not as his partner of 11 years, not as someone who had existed in his life in any capacity at any point. The obituary described a man that Celeste had been legally married to for 11 years, as though she had never been in the room. As though the marriage license and the joint accounts and the Lakeview house and the specific ordinary texture of 11 years of shared life were details that could simply be omitted from the public record of a man's existence without anyone with any legitimate standing objecting to their absence. Someone with legitimate standing had just objected. Celeste set down her phone and she looked at her office wall for a long time, and then she picked up her phone again, and she called Bernard's number out of a reflex that her hands executed before her mind had fully caught up with what her eyes had just read, and then she stopped the call before it connected because she remembered why she was calling, and she sat with the phone in her hand, and the specific weight of what she now knew settled into her the way heavy things settle, which is slowly and completely, and without asking permission. She understood several things in those first minutes, and she understood them in the order that a forensic accountant understands things, which is from the most specific detail outward toward the full picture. The first thing she understood was that Bernard was dead. The second thing she understood was that he had been dead for at least 3 days because the obituary described services that had already been scheduled. The third thing she understood was that his family had known he was dead for at least 3 days and had not called her. The fourth thing she understood was that the decision not to call her was not an oversight. It was a position. And the fifth thing she understood, the thing that sat heaviest of all, was that the position had been in place long enough and with enough organizational coherence that someone had been able to write and edit and submit and publish an obituary describing her husband's life in a way that erased her existence from it entirely without a single person involved in that process feeling the need to hesitate. Stay with me, because what Celeste found when she started following the trail is something that none of Bernard's family anticipated, and the ending of this story is not a confrontation in a funeral home, and it is not a public scene, and it is not a letter to the editor of the Times-Picayune requesting a correction, and it is not a dramatic moment where anyone is forced to acknowledge out loud what they did. What it is something quieter and more legally permanent than any of those things, and it begins with a forensic accountant sitting at her desk on a Thursday morning in October, picking up her phone not to call her dead husband, but to call a New Orleans estate attorney. Subscribe to Psyche Tales TV right now if you have not already, because we tell the stories on this channel that nobody else is telling, and this community is growing every single day. Drop your location in the comments right now and tell us. If you discovered your husband had died and found out from an obituary that erased you completely, what would your very first move be? We read every single comment, and we want to hear from you before this story is over. New Orleans, Louisiana, 2012. Celeste Fontenot was 33 years old when she married Bernard Fontenot at a small ceremony in the Treme neighborhood of the city where she had grown up and where her mother Vivian had raised her and her brother Desmond in a narrow house on a street where the neighbors had known each other for decades, and where the specific warm texture of New Orleans community life was not a tourist attraction, but simply the way things were and had always been. Celeste had grown up understanding that New Orleans was a city with a long memory, and that the legal and cultural and financial systems of that city operated according to their own logic. A logic inherited from French and Spanish colonial periods, and from the specific history of Louisiana that made it different from every other state in the country in ways that mattered enormously if you were a forensic accountant who needed to understand how assets moved and who owned what and what the law said about the rights of the people involved. She had studied accounting at Xavier University in New Orleans. She had gotten her forensic accounting certification and gone to work at a mid-sized New Orleans firm, where she had spent 15 years building a reputation for the specific quality of following a financial trail wherever it led, regardless of how uncomfortable the destination was for the people whose finances were being examined. Her colleagues called her the most patient woman they had ever watched. Work because Celeste did not rush toward conclusions, and she did not announce what she was finding as she found it, and she did not allow the pressure of other people's discomfort with the process to cause her to move faster than the evidence supported. She followed the trail, and she documented what she found, and she waited until the picture was complete before she said what the picture showed. This quality, which had made her one of the most effective forensic accountants in New Orleans, had also shaped the specific way she approached her personal life and her personal relationships, and the specific way she had approached Bernard Fontenot when she met him at a professional event in 2010. Bernard was 38 when they met, 5 years older than Celeste, a commercial property manager who had been building his client base across New Orleans and the surrounding parishes for the better part of a decade. He managed residential and commercial properties for landlords who did not want to handle daily operations themselves, and he had built a reputation in that specific field for the same quality that made him appealing as a husband, which was reliability. Bernard Fontenot was the person who handled things, who showed up when he said he would show up, who completed what he said he would complete, who did not require drama or recognition to do his work consistently and well. Celeste had watched him for 2 years before she agreed to marry him. 2 years of careful observation in the specific way that she observed everything, which was completely and without announcing that she was doing it. She had watched how he handled professional situations and how he handled social situations and how he handled the small, ordinary difficulties that reveal a person's character more completely than any dramatic test ever could. She had found him to be exactly what he presented himself as being, which was a steady, reliable man who had built a modest but solid professional life in New Orleans and who wanted to build a more complete personal life alongside it with her. She had married him in 2012, and they had bought a house together in the Lakeview neighborhood in 2014, and they had established the specific, ordinary rhythms of a marriage that was not dramatic, but that was genuine and that functioned in the particular way that two organized, capable people's lives can function when they have both committed to building something together. Celeste managed their shared finances with the same meticulous attention she brought to her professional work. She knew their accounts and their assets and their expenses with the level of granularity that most couples never develop. Because most couples do not have a forensic accountant for a spouse, she thought she knew everything there was to know about their financial life together, and she was right about almost all of it and wrong about one specific thing in a way that had been made possible by a deliberate and sustained effort to keep her from knowing it. Celeste's mother, Vivian, had met Bernard several times over the years of the marriage and had told Celeste privately and more than once that she liked him well enough, but that there was something about him she could not fully place, something she described as the quality of a man who was always slightly more comfortable than the situation required, slightly too at ease, slightly too prepared for whatever question was asked of him, as though he had considered in advance what each conversation might require and had arranged himself accordingly before it began. Celeste had heard this observation from her mother and had filed it carefully in the same part of her mind where she filed everything she was not yet ready to act on, and she had continued to be the wife she had always been while she waited to understand what her mother was describing from the inside. She understood on a Thursday morning in October. Bernard had died on a Monday morning of a heart attack at the age of 54. He had been at his office when it happened, and paramedics had been called, and he had been taken to a New Orleans hospital where he had died before anyone who worked with him had been able to reach anyone in his personal life. or so the version that reached Celeste would eventually suggest. Though Celeste would come to understand that the version of events that reached her and the sequence in which various people were notified about Bernard's death were not accidental outcomes, but the result of decisions made by people who had a specific interest in controlling the order in which information was distributed and to whom. What Celeste knew on that Thursday morning was that she had spent the Monday and the Tuesday and the Wednesday after Bernard's death going about her entirely normal life. She had gone to work and come home and made dinner and watched the evening news and done the ordinary things of an ordinary week without knowing that the man whose reading glasses were on the kitchen table and whose truck was in the driveway and whose coffee cup was in the dish rack had been dead since Monday morning. 3 days. 3 full days had passed between the moment Bernard died and the moment a colleague forwarded an obituary link to Celeste with a question mark. And those 3 days are the most telling detail in this entire story, because a wife does not go uncalled for 3 days after her husband dies unless the people who know he is dead have made a specific and deliberate decision that she is not the person who needs to be told. The obituary had been written and edited and submitted to the Times-Picayune on the Wednesday evening and published on Thursday morning, and Celeste had found out not from a phone call from anyone in Bernard's family, and not from a call from the hospital, and not from anyone who had known Bernard professionally, but from a forwarded link with a question mark from a colleague who had seen the name and the photograph and had not known what else to do. The first thing Celeste did after she sat with the phone in her hand for the appropriate amount of time was to follow the trail. She had spent 15 years following trails, and the specific discipline of that work was the thing that served her most in those first hours, because following a trail required her to move systematically from what she knew toward what she did not yet know, and the movement itself gave her something to do with the specific energy that was building in her, which was too large and too complex to be contained, but which she understood could not be allowed to express itself prematurely, because expressing it prematurely would give the people on the other side of this situation time to prepare for what was coming. The first thing she followed was the Gentilly address listed in the obituary. She looked up that address and found that it was a house. A 3-bedroom house on Abundant Street in the Gentilly neighborhood of New Orleans, a neighborhood on the other side of the city from the Lakeview house where she and Bernard had lived together for 9 years. She looked at the property records for that Gentilly address and found that the house had been purchased in 2013, 1 year after their wedding, and that it was registered in Bernard's name with a notation indicating it had been purchased as a primary residence, not as an investment property, not as a rental unit that he was managing for a client, as a place where Bernard Fontenot had declared to the official property records of Orleans Parish that he lived, which meant that Bernard Fontenot had been simultaneously declaring to one set of official records that his primary residence was a house in Gentilly, while declaring to another set of official records that his primary residence was the house in Lakeview that he shared with his legal wife. She looked at these 2 sets of records for a long time, and then she looked at the business account records for Bernard's property management company, which she had access to because she had always managed their shared finances, and she found something in those records that transformed the picture from significant to complete. Bernard had been paying the utilities at the Gentilly address from his business account consistently since 2013. 12 years of utility payments for a house that she had not known existed coming out of an account whose stated purpose was property management operating expenses. She had reviewed that account regularly over the years and had seen those payments and had believed they were associated with one of the properties in Bernard's management portfolio and had never looked more closely at the specific address because she had trusted that the account's contents matched its stated purpose, and Bernard had understood that her trust in that specific area was the leverage point that made the entire construction possible. The construction had been running for 12 years, 2 households, 2 complete domestic lives, one man managing both of them with the same organizational efficiency he applied to his property portfolio, the Celeste in Lakeview and the Sylvia in Gentilly, and the Bernard who moved between them as reliably and as methodically as he moved between any of the properties in his professional portfolio. Celeste looked at everything she had found, and she sat with it for the remainder of that Thursday, and then on Friday morning, she called Patricia Arsenault. Patricia Arsenault was 58 years old and had practiced estate law in New Orleans for 30 years, and was one of the most experienced practitioners of Louisiana estate law in the city. Louisiana estate law was its own specific landscape that operated under a civil law tradition inherited from the French and Spanish colonial periods, and that had specific provisions regarding the rights of surviving spouses that differed significantly from the common law traditions that governed estate matters in the other 49 states of the Union. Patricia had seen many variations of the situation that Celeste was bringing to her office on that Friday morning, but she had rarely seen a client arrive with the level of documentation and organizational clarity that Celeste placed on her desk. Celeste had brought organized folders containing the property records for both the Lakeview house and the Gentilly house. The business account records showing 12 years of utility payments to the Gentilly address. The joint account records showing the full picture of marital assets accumulated over 11 years, the marriage certificate, the deed to the Lakeview house showing both names, and a timeline she had constructed the previous evening documenting the relationship between the purchase of the Gentilly house in 2013 and the funds in the business account that had been used to maintain it over the following 12 years. Patricia looked at what Celeste had placed on her desk and said, "You have been doing my job for me," Celeste said. "I have been doing my job." Patricia told her 3 things that Celeste needed to understand about her legal position under Louisiana law. The first was that Louisiana was a community property state, and that the assets accumulated during Bernard and Celeste's 11-year marriage were presumed under Louisiana law to be community property, belonging equally to both spouses regardless of whose name appeared on any individual account or deed. The second was that Celeste's rights to that community property were not contingent on the obituary's acknowledgement of her existence or on Bernard's family's willingness to recognize her standing. The law did not require the Times-Picayune's permission to operate, and it did not require Odette Fontenot's cooperation to produce its outcomes. The third thing Patricia told her was that the Gentilly house presented a specific and significant complication for Bernard's estate because it had been purchased and maintained using funds from an account that had community property character, which meant that the asset itself carried Celeste's fingerprints in a legal sense regardless of whose name was on the deed. Patricia said, "The family submitted that obituary believing it would be the final word on who had standing in this estate." She said, "It was not the final word," Celeste said. "I know," Patricia said. "I will need everything you have." Celeste said, "I brought everything I have." Patricia looked at the organized folders on her desk and said, "Of course you did." Subscribe to Psyche Tales TV right now because this story is about to show you what happens when the family that erased a wife from a public document discovers that the legal document does not erase as easily as the newspaper does, and you need to be here for this part. Tell us in the comments. When you read that the obituary listed another woman as Bernard's partner, did you immediately think the family knew exactly what they were doing, or did you think for a moment that it might have been a mistake? Drop your answer below because some of you knew immediately, and some of you gave them the benefit of the doubt, and we want to hear from both of you before this story ends. Celeste made a deliberate decision in the days following her first meeting with Patricia Arsenault not to contact Bernard's family, and not to contact Sylvia, and not to contact the Times-Picayune, and not to appear at the funeral services that the obituary had announced. She made this decision for the same reason she made every professional decision, which was that announcing what you know and what you intend to do about it before you have fully established your legal position is how you give the people on the other side of a situation the time and the information they need to prepare a response to what you are about to do. Bernard's family did not know that Celeste had found the obituary. They did not know that she had followed the trail to the Gentilly address. They did not know that she had found the property records and the 12 years of utility payments in the business account. They did not know that she had spent a Friday morning with Patricia Arsenault and had left that office with a clear understanding of exactly what Louisiana community property law said about her rights and exactly how thoroughly those rights were supported by the documentation she had assembled. They did not know any of it because Celeste had not told them, and because the specific assumption behind the obituary, the assumption that had made the obituary's particular erasure seem like a viable strategy, was the same assumption that had made Bernard's parallel life possible for 12 years. The assumption was that Celeste could be managed by being kept uninformed, and that if she was kept uninformed long enough the information would become irrelevant because the decisions that depended on her not having it would already have been made and executed and completed. Bernard had operated on this assumption for 12 years, and had been right about it for 12 years because Celeste had genuinely not known and had had no specific reason to look. But the obituary had given her a reason to look, and she had looked, and the assumption had encountered the specific problem that all assumptions of its type eventually encounter when they are applied to the wrong person. Bernard's mother, Odette, retained an estate attorney, and that attorney reviewed Patricia's filings, and then had a conversation with Odette that Celeste was not present for, but that Patricia described to her afterward as the specific kind of conversation that happens when an attorney has to explain to a client that the strategy they believed was in place did not account for a variable that is now fully in play and cannot be removed from play by any action available to them at this stage of the proceedings. The variable was Celeste's documentation and Celeste's attorney and Celeste's 15 years of professional training in following financial trails and Celeste's specific and thorough understanding of the community property that she and Bernard had accumulated over 11 years of marriage, and that Louisiana law protected regardless of what any obituary had said about who had standing to receive it. The estate settlement took 8 months, and it produced an outcome that reflected the full legal weight of 11 years of marriage in a community property state, and the full professional capability of a forensic accountant who had known exactly where to look and exactly what she was looking at from the first Thursday morning when she opened that link on her phone. The Lakeview house, which was already in both their names, transferred fully to Celeste. The community share of the business assets was calculated by a court-appointed appraiser and distributed according to Louisiana law. The Gentilly house was sold, and the proceeds were divided according to the proportion of community funds that had been documented as contributing to its purchase and maintenance over 12 years. Sylvia received what Bernard had designated for her through mechanisms that did not intersect with the community property that belonged to Celeste as a matter of Louisiana law, and that Patricia had been careful to fully establish and document and protect throughout the 8 months of proceedings. The obituary remained in the Times-Picayune archive exactly as it had been published, and Celeste did not request a correction and did not contact the newspaper and did not write a letter to the editor and did not contact Odette Fontenot or Clement or Adrian or anyone else in Bernard's family to tell them what she thought about the decision they had made when they sat down to write that obituary, she told Patricia when the settlement was finalized that the obituary could say whatever it wanted to say about who Bernard was and who had mattered to him and who deserved to be named in the public record of his life, because the legal record said something different, and the legal record was the one that actually produced the outcomes that mattered, and the legal record had never required the obituary's permission to be true. Celeste sold the Lakeview house 18 months after the settlement, because she wanted a space that did not contain the specific architecture of a marriage she was still in the process of fully understanding, and she found a house in the Trumay neighborhood near where she had grown up, a narrow New Orleans house on a street she had known since childhood. And she bought it, and she began to renovate it slowly and with considerable personal satisfaction, because there is a specific satisfaction in choosing every detail of a space that is going to contain your life, and having nobody to negotiate those details with, because the space is entirely yours and the choices are entirely yours, and the life you are building inside it is being built according to your own specifications without accommodation or compromise. Her mother Vivian came to help her paint the front room on a Saturday in March, and the two of them spent that afternoon with paint rollers and drop cloths and the specific warm, easy conversation that the particular relationship between a mother and a daughter who understand each other produces when neither of them is in crisis and both of them are doing something useful with their hands. Vivian told Celeste that afternoon that she had known something about Bernard did not add up from the first time she had met him, and Celeste told her that she had filed that observation in the appropriate place, and Vivian said that was the most forensic accountant response to anything she had ever heard, and they both laughed, and the laughter in that freshly painted front room in the Trumay was the specific sound of two people who have been through something significant together arriving on the other side of it, and discovering that the other side has good light and enough space, and the specific quiet pleasure of a Saturday afternoon that belongs entirely to them. Celeste Fontenot is 45 years old now, and she still works in forensic accounting in New Orleans, and she is better at her work than she was before the Thursday morning in October, because the 8 months between reading the obituary and the finalization of the estate settlement taught her something about the relationship between her professional capabilities and her personal life that she had been keeping in separate. compartments without fully understanding that the compartments were the same room. She had spent 15 years being one of the most effective forensic accountants in New Orleans, and she had spent those same 15 years believing on some level that the skills that made her effective professionally occupied a different part of her than the parts that were involved in being a wife, and building a marriage, and trusting the person she had chosen to trust. And what the obituary and everything that followed it taught her was that those skills did not live in a professional compartment that could be kept separate from the rest of her life. They lived in her entirely, and they were available to her in any situation that required them as long as she was willing to use them honestly and to follow the trail wherever it led regardless of how uncomfortable the destination was. She told me that the moment she thinks about most from those 8 months is not the settlement, and it is not the 8 months of work that Patricia Arsenault did in the Louisiana court system, and it is not the Saturday she and Vivian painted the front room of the Treme house. The moment she thinks about most is the 4 minutes between opening the obituary link on her phone and understanding everything it was telling her, and the moment she picked up her phone not to call Bernard, but to start following the trail. Because in those 4 minutes, she made the clearest decision of her adult life, which was that she was not going to be managed by what she did not know, that she was going to know everything, that she was going to follow the trail completely and document what she found and position herself correctly within the full picture of the situation before she said a single word to anyone on the other side of it. And the obituary that had tried to edit her out of the public record of her husband's life discovered that the legal record is considerably more difficult to edit than a newspaper. Here is what stays with me about Celeste Fontenot. The people who wrote that obituary understood something that is true about narrative documents. They understood that there is a specific kind of power in being the ones who get to write the story about who a person was and who mattered to them and who deserves to be acknowledged in the public record of their existence. And they understood that when someone reads their own erasure in a public document, the emotional weight of what they are reading can be so overwhelming that they may not immediately think clearly about what other records exist and what those records say and what legal standing those records produce. And they were right that the emotional weight was significant. Celeste has told me that reading the obituary was one of the most disorienting experiences of her life, not because of what it said about Sylvia, but because of what it said about the scale and the duration and the specific deliberate organization of what had been kept from her and what the people around Bernard had known and agreed to maintain and protect for years. But the people who wrote the obituary were wrong about what she would do next because they did not understand that the woman they had tried to erase from the narrative of her husband's life had spent 15 years developing the specific capability of looking past the narrative and finding the record that existed underneath it, the record that did not depend on anyone's willingness to acknowledge it or include it or publish it in a newspaper, the record that Louisiana law had been constructing quietly and completely throughout 11 years of marriage, regardless of what Bernard's family knew or intended or believed would happen after he was gone. The obituary told the story that Bernard's family wanted told. The legal record told the story that Louisiana law required to be told. And Louisiana law has never required anyone's permission to say what it says. So here's what I want to ask you before you go. The first question is about the decision to publish that obituary. Bernard's family sat down and wrote a document describing his life, and they included Sylvia, and they excluded Celeste, and they submitted it to a New Orleans newspaper, and they let it be published. Do you think they did this because they genuinely believed that Sylvia was the rightful person to be named, and that Celeste had no claim to that acknowledgement? Or do you think they understood exactly what they were doing and made a calculated decision that Celeste either would not find out or would not have the knowledge and the resources and the will to challenge the estate after they had organized it according to their own understanding of who deserved what? And the second question is about Celeste's decision to say nothing publicly and to let Patricia's legal work do what the obituary had tried to prevent. There are people who would say that Celeste should have stood up publicly and named what Bernard's family did and demanded that the record be corrected in the same newspaper that published the erasure. Do you think that approach would have produced something important that the legal settlement did not produce? Or do you think Celeste made the right decision in understanding that the legal record was the one that mattered and that making a public scene would have cost her energy that was better spent on the work that produced a permanent and legally binding outcome? Drop your answers in the comments because I genuinely want to know what you think, and this story is going to produce one of the longest and most divided comment conversations we have ever had on this channel, because people feel strongly about both of those questions, and they should. If this story made you think about who controls the narrative of your own life, and who would have the power to edit that narrative if you were no longer able to protect it yourself, share it with someone who needs to think about that question too. Hit the like button if Celeste Fontenot reminded you of someone you know, and subscribe to Psyche Tales TV, because we are telling the stories that matter on this channel, and this community is growing every single day, and we are grateful for every single one of you who is here with us. Take care of yourself. I will see you in the next one.